Football, or soccer, is a growing entity in the American sporting landscape, and its popularity has undoubtedly soared over the last 2 decades or so. The MLS currently has 28 franchises and will add St. Louis City to the roster in 2023. It includes teams owned or part-owned by the likes of David Beckham, James Harden and Will Ferrell, to name just a few big-name celebrities involved in the league, and the average attendance at MLS matches this season is 20,448, over 2,000 more than Serie A managed last season. It still lags behind staple US sports like American football, basketball and baseball, but the investment into the sport in recent times has meant that there is now a veritable and sustainable market for soccer in the US. And whilst I'm thinking about it, if you hadn't noticed it already, I will use the term soccer throughout this video rather than football for consistency, unless necessary to do otherwise. Believe it or not, the MLS is the 5th top flight equivalent soccer league that the USA has had to date, and realistically, it looks like the first one where things won't spectacularly implode on themselves. Before the MLS, there was the NASL, a competition that had heavy investment, spanned for 16 years from 1968 to 1984, and attracted players of the caliber of Johan Cruyff, Franz Beckenbauer, George Best, and Pele, but collapsed following declining in-person and TV viewing figures and the pullout of many of the major broadcasters that had poured so much into the league. Long before the NASL, there was the American League of Professional Football, which was set up in 1894 by baseball teams who wanted to bring in more revenue during the winter months, but only lasted a couple of years, and the semi-professional National Association Football League, which immediately followed it. But it is the league which followed the NAFL, namely the American Soccer League, which is the focus of today's video. Whilst a lot has been made of the NASL and, of course, the MLS, the ASL seems to have slipped under the radar and has almost been forgotten, in spite of how much potential the league had, the names it brought in from overseas, and what it could have meant to US soccer moving forward. However, it is a topic which subscriber Outflick of Seda wanted me to cover, and since their name sounds like an Anglo-Saxon warrior monarch, I shall suitably oblige, because I fear as though if I didn't make this video, they would send an army with spears, swords and axes to kill me. But if you have any other stories, topics or events you want me to cover, let me know which ones down in the comments below. And whilst you're here, of course, if you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But without any further ado, here is the story of the American Soccer League and what might have been for US soccer. As mentioned, America had tried to establish a professional soccer league twice before 1921. Following the ill-fated and short-lived American League of Professional Football, there was the National Association Football League, which had been set up for teams in the New Jersey, New York, and Philadelphia regions in 1895. However, after just 4 years of existence, the competition was put on an indefinite hiatus. A recession throughout 1899 and 1900, exacerbated by the Spanish-American War in 1898 and America's ongoing conflict in the Philippines, led to some sporting competitions and organizations ceasing operations, including the NAFL and the American Football Association, US soccer's governing body. Over half a decade later, the authorities realized that there was still a market for soccer as a result of a few lucrative and well-attended tours from teams overseas. So the NAFL and AFA came back in 1906, although this time the league was strictly amateur and semi-professional rather than professional, which it had been beforehand. The formation of the American Amateur Football Association in 1911 caused more headaches, as they established their own domestic cup to rival that had been set up by the AFA. After numerous other local soccer organizations signed up to the AFA, who rebranded themselves as the United States Football Association in 1913, they sought membership to FIFA. The AFA actively did all that they could to prevent this from happening, but their attempts proved in vain, and eventually they accepted their fate and merged with the USFA. Some sources claim in 1913, and others within the decade after that. However, the National Association Football League was not affiliated to either USFA or the AFA, and clubs themselves had to organise their league matches independently. This meant that the bigger clubs were hemorrhaging cash when travelling long distances to face smaller teams, who in turn couldn't cope with their financial strains, in spite of the money that those larger clubs were subsidising to them through gate receipts and travel expenses. And more often than not, they would fold, often during a league campaign. This led to those larger teams deciding that the league in its current form no longer worked, and nor was it financially sustainable for them to compete in. So in 1921, they broke away from the NAFL and, at a meeting at Manhattan's Astor Hotel, merged with a number of teams from the Southern New England Football League to set up the American Soccer League, with the intent being to create America's first sustainable and financially viable professional soccer league. It received approval from the USFA in May 1921 and began its first league season later that year, and almost immediately the teams received even more financial backing than they'd received before, albeit one of them still folded partway through the campaign. One of the key factors behind the league getting off the ground straight away with such large resources was because of how successfully the American economy was performing at the time. Despite 1920 being the most deflationary year in US history as a result of the struggles brought about by switching back to a peacetime economy following World War I, it recovered rapidly, with industrial regions benefiting the most. Unsurprisingly then, the teams in the ASL came from such industrial areas, such as New York and Boston, and a few companies even named their clubs directly after themselves, including Indiana Flooring, J&P Coats FC, and Todd Shipyards. And we thought RB Leipzig and RB Salzburg were bad enough. The league was an immediate success, both with the players and the fans. The players were paid substantially more than any of their European contemporaries and were offered lucrative jobs at the companies who owned the teams that they played for, and attendances at games were frequently in the five-figure region, especially games that were played in New England. What's more, thanks to America's successful immigration policy at the start of the 1920s, factories employed many workers from Europe who had brought with them a love of soccer from the continent, which helped its popularity grow even more. All of this resulted in soccer becoming the second most popular sport in America behind baseball, even ahead of American football. The first two ASL titles were won by Philadelphia FC and J&P Coats FC, but in 1924, the first true dynasty of American soccer began. Massachusetts-based Fall River United had been bought in 1922 by Sam Mark, a baseball and basketball promoter who had no natural love for soccer whatsoever. However, he recognised how important it was for the region to have a successful soccer team, and he wanted to make a profit from the sport's burgeoning popularity for himself. As such, he renamed the team Fall River Marksmen and moved them to a new stadium in Rhode Island, unassumingly named the Sam Mark Stadium, which meant that they avoided Massachusetts' strict blue laws, which would have prevented the club from taking any income or even welcoming fans into their ground on Sundays. He also started to recruit players from overseas en masse, enticing them with much better wages than what they were receiving at the time. His plans came to fruition, and the club won a hat-trick of league titles from 1924 to 1926, and in 1925 their average attendance was higher than that of the Boston Red Sox. Other clubs, realizing how profitable the Marksmen's marketing strategy was proving to be, engaged in similar practices of their own, with the Boston Woodworkers and their owner G.A.G. Wood forming an entire squad consisting almost solely of foreign imports. For the 1924-25 season, the year the league expanded from 8 to 12 teams, he enticed Rangers midfielder Tommy Muirhead to join as player coach. But most significantly of all, Scottish international Alex McNabb was convinced to move to Boston after receiving a weekly wage offer 3 times as much as he was earning at the time at Greenock Morton. A year later, Hakowa Vienna, who were one of the most successful teams in Europe at the time, went on a tour of the US, and 8 of their players, after being told of the riches on offer to them in America, decided to stay on and sign for an ASL team, even though they remained under contract to Hakowa. In total, 53 players who had won caps for various European countries were on the books of ASL clubs throughout the 1920s. This led to the Scottish press dubbing the league, their clubs and their owners as the American Menace, but their claims were definitely not born out of spite. The owners were signing players who were still under contract at other European clubs who had refused to release them from their contracts, so it meant that their practices fell foul of FIFA's international contract protocols. Mind you, even with the influx of foreign talent, there was still space for homegrown stars to shine. These included Bert Paternold, a striker of French heritage who FIFA acknowledged as being the man who scored the first ever World Cup hat-trick in 1930, Billy Gonzalez, a pacey and tricky forward who was dubbed the Babe Ruth of soccer, and Archie Stark, a Scottish-born American immigrant who scored 232 goals in 205 games for Bethlehem Steel. Make no mistake though, the allure of the league to foreign players was what really set it apart, and it meant that, in all likelihood, it probably had the highest ratio of foreign players to homegrown players out of any professional league in the world at the time. Eventually, in 1927, following complaints from both Austria and Hungary, an agreement was reached between FIFA and the USFA to make sure that ASL clubs formally acknowledged the rules and stopped signing international players illegally. Unsurprisingly, this angered the clubs' owners, who didn't take kindly to the changes proposed, but it worked for the USFA, since they wanted to start Americanizing the league and ridding themselves of the foreign imports. They believed that the reason why US soccer hadn't grown even more was that the sport was still too foreign and cosmopolitan, so they introduced a series of rules that distinguished their competition from all the others. From 1925 onwards, the league was determined on a system based on the percentage of points that teams had won from the games they had played, rather than the 2 points for a win and 1 point for a draw system that was commonplace in Europe and had been used in the ASL up to that point. For example, because I'm aware of how confusing that sounds, Fall River Marksmen played 44 games in 1925-26, winning 30, drawing 12 and losing the other 2, meaning that they won 72 out of the 88 points available, leading to a percentage of 0.819%, which is more than any other team managed that year, hence why they were the league champions. However, only 2 teams actually played the full 44 game quota that was scheduled for that season, with 4th place Bethlehem Steel only managing 35, so it wasn't exactly a perfect system by any means. In 1926, the league introduced substitutions, something which England wouldn't adopt until 1965, and the year after, they implemented a playoff system to determine the league winners, similar to what the MLS currently uses. The most contentious policy of them all, though, was the aforementioned restrictions on signing foreign players, and ultimately, that particular infight was one of a few factors that led to the league crumbling at the seams, as all the soccer Avengers in America prior to the MLS seemed to do. Something which perhaps played a bigger role in the league's demise, however, was the animosity surrounding the country's domestic cups, which had been unresolved for the best part of 2 decades. Originally, the AFA ran the American Cup, primarily consisting of teams from the northeast region of the country and not much beyond that, with teams only as far west as Philadelphia ever competing in it. But after the USFA established the National Challenge Cup in 1913, which included teams from a much wider playing field than the American Cup ever did, it became the USA's premier domestic cup competition, relegating the American Cup to secondary status. The National Challenge Cup was still ongoing by the time the ASL started in 1921, but their clubs were once again not best pleased about having to travel large distances to face amateur teams in return for meagre gate receipts and huge travel expenses. Plus, a large majority of the money made from those games went to the USFA rather than the clubs themselves. To add to this, the league had its own heavily sponsored cup competition called the Lewis Cup, essentially the equivalent of the English League Cup, which ran during the league season and created scheduling clashes with the National Challenge Cup. Things almost came to a head in 1924 when the ASL threatened to boycott the NCC entirely, but the USFA reached a compromise by forming the National Amateur Cup, which meant that amateur teams had their own competition and would be removed from competing in the NCC, which satisfied the ASL clubs and their owners. 4 years later though, with these financial issues still not having truly gone away, a man by the name of Charles Stoneham came into the fray and essentially instigated what became known as the Soccer Wars. Stoneham was a shady character prior to his arrival in US soccer, having owned numerous gambling firms, been involved in the dissolution of no fewer than 3 separate companies, and been indicted on counts of perjury and fraud, the former of which he was charged for, but the latter of which he was acquitted of. In 1927, he purchased Indiana Flooring and wanted to rename them the New York Giants after the baseball team, which, coincidentally enough, he himself had purchased in 1919 for $1 million. But since there was already a team in the league with the word Giants in their name, he settled for New York Nationals instead. He quickly became the vice president of the ASL and, in his new role, he brought back up the issue of the NCC not being a financially viable competition for ASL clubs. This time around, there would be no compromise reached, and Stoneham instructed all of the league's teams to boycott the 1928 tournament. 3 teams chose to ignore Stoneham's request and enter the competition regardless, the most significant of which being Bethlehem Steel, the incumbent Lewis Cup champions and winners of the ASL in 1927. Those three teams were fined $1,000 and barred from competing in the 1928-29 ASL, so they broke away and formed the Eastern Professional Soccer League, a competition which was backed by the USFA, who branded Stoneham and the ASL more broadly as outlaws. FIFA even waded in on the issue and sided with the USFA, although their involvement was controversial as it led to the USFA having a reputation of being anti-American, as they had sought outside influence and help on a specifically American matter. Within a year, both parties had realised that this new league structure was no longer viable, so they allowed the previously banned teams back into the ASL midway through the 1929-30 campaign. By that point though, the final blow to the ASL's future as a viable and sustainable professional soccer league in America had already been struck. In October 1929, the effects of people overspending beyond their means and trade companies overproducing to keep up with high demands throughout the previous decade finally reared their ugly head as the stock market crashed spectacularly and what became known as the Great Depression set in. GDP fell by nearly 30%, industrial output nearly halved from its pre-1929 levels, a third of American banks collapsed, and a quarter of the population were left unemployed as a result of the crisis. This meant that ticket prices to soccer matches for working class people became extortionate, and that, coupled with the public's anger at the petty arguments about cup competitions and league boycotts, led to attendances dropping significantly and the appetite for soccer waning. They saw the intervention of FIFA as a betrayal of American values, that no outside influence should affect American issues, and it led to soccer garnering a reputation of being nothing more than a foreign sport which clashed with the ideologies of a traditional American citizen. In 1930, when the Fall River Marksmen achieved an unprecedented treble of winning both halves of the league season and the Lewis Cup, no one really paid too much attention to it. The Fall River Herald News wrote an article about their success which came across as a eulogy rather than a commemoration, with a quote of, "Despite the fact that the Fall River team performed a feat unheard of in American soccer, that of winning every title possible in one season, their fans have adopted a don't care attitude that does not make the future of the game here look too promising." Just 8 years after it had got off the ground, the league was already on its last legs, crippled by an ever-growing financial black hole and an ever-diminishing fan base. In spite of all the chaos unfurling around it, the US national team were invited to compete at the inaugural World Cup finals in Uruguay in 1930, an invitation which they duly accepted. They topped a group containing Paraguay and Belgium, beating both of them 3-0, to reach the semi-finals, where they were promptly thrashed 6-1 by Argentina. But that run remains the furthest that any North American nation has gone at a World Cup finals, some 92 years on. However, it didn't feel as though it was a World Cup run with the entire nation behind the squad, but instead it came across as nothing more than the last stand of the golden age of US soccer. The 1932-33 season was allegedly abandoned halfway through, with attempts at a restart with a spring-autumn calendar failing spectacularly, and in the summer of 1933, the ASL folded for good, to be replaced by a semi-professional league of the same name. Soccer immediately slipped out of the public consciousness, as did the ASL. Its records were lost during World War II, and in the 1960s, reports mentioned that the first ASL champions were crowned in 1933-34, rather than in 1921-22. However, thanks to people like David Wagnerin and Colin Jose, who unearthed the details about the ASL and wrote books profiling the short-lived and ill-fated league, we now know a lot more about it than we otherwise would have, and they may well be the reasons as to why I have been able to make this video. But in spite of how pivotal it could have been for American soccer moving forward, if it weren't for external circumstances and petty infights, it seems as though America doesn't really want to acknowledge the existence of this competition, given how much damage it did to soccer's reputation in the country at the time. Whilst the ASL would soldier on bravely for another 50 years, there was barely any interest in it at all, and even though the USA stunned the footballing world by beating England at the 1950 World Cup, it would take until the late 1960s and the introduction of the NASL before any meaningful attempt was made to revitalise the sport in America, over 30 years after the biggest what-if in American soccer history had come caving in on itself. As a result, instead of soccer being in a very comfortable second place in terms of popularity and nationwide appeal, as it ought to have been given the league's success, it has been struggling to reach higher than 5th until very recently. Of course, no one in the ASL could have stopped the Great Depression and the ramifications that it caused, but the league could, and probably should, have done more positive things for soccer's reputation in America rather than negative, and because of its ultimately ill-fated conclusion, they still aren't a global soccer powerhouse and, in all likelihood, probably won't be for at least another decade, if not more. And that just about wraps up today's video looking at the ill-fated American Soccer League of the 1920s and early 1930s. If you did enjoy this video, of course, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. You can also ring the notification bell to get notified whenever I upload a video straight away, and why not follow me on Twitter as well? The link to it is in the description down below, or the username is simply @Hazzabhajan. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.